Hi guys, this is Mason with Varsity, and welcome to our YouTube channel. This is the topic analysis video for November and December on lawful access to encrypted communications. This is our first topic analysis video for our first brief. Wow, what a topic, lawful access. Initially, it wasn't my favorite because I thought it was a bit restricted in terms of offense that AF and neg could run. I thought there was not much variety in warrants, which I still think, but I think that lends itself to having pretty nuanced debates. If there's only a couple warrants, you get to really dive deep into what those arguments mean, the impacts of it, all of the technology. I think it's going to lend itself to some pretty interesting debates. So before we get into the nuances of AF and neg, let's first look at what this topic is about as a whole. So it's about the fundamental question of whether law enforcement should have the ability to require technology companies to give them decrypted communications of their users, which is going to tie into this first idea of end-to-end encryption, which I think is a term you're going to really need to know in any debate, because it's effectively what this resolution changes. End-to-end encryption is the idea of fully encrypting messages from the sender to the recipient, without the technology company or the service provider being able to decrypt and read those messages. For example, over iMessage, if I send a text to Michael, Apple cannot read that text, nor can they read the information in any of their iMessages because it's end-to-end encrypted. They do not have a decryption key. Apple does not have one to be able to decrypt those messages. So if they were served with a search warrant from lawful access or from law enforcement, they would not be able to provide decrypted versions of those communications. That's what this resolution changes. It effectively bans end-to-end encryption because it requires a backdoor be implemented for service providers to be able to decrypt those messages and provide them to law enforcement when served with a search warrant. And that's going to lead itself to a couple key points of clash. The first being crime prevention, where AF is going to say that increased law enforcement access to communications helps them crack down on dangerous crimes, like child sexual abuse material that gets spread over the internet, like drug trafficking, all kinds of stuff like that, organized crime that rely on encrypted communications for their messaging. Neg is going to say a couple things in response. First, they're going to question whether or not that actually works. Secondly, they're going to dive into the ideas of data security and government abuse. On that first idea, implementing a backdoor of any kind, there's a lot of evidence that says it's inherently just going to make data security worse. It's inherently going to make encryption weaker. It's going to open up that same backdoor for use from hackers, bad actors, and law enforcement when it's not supposed to be able to get in. That's the second idea on government abuse. Next, going to bring up the question of whether or not law enforcement, especially this current administration, should be able to have effectively unfettered access to private communications. Whether or not the benefits of preventing a little bit of crime outweigh the rights abuses and the potential government surveillance impacts of law enforcement access to private communication.
Hey Mason, thanks for that excellent intro, and I'm really excited to jump right into this topic lecture. So what exactly are we looking at first? Well, the first thing that we would like to do is evaluate how specifically you guys should be running the affirmative side of this debate. When you're looking at the topic as a whole, it's really sticky, and when I started looking at basically how to research affirmative arguments and blocks in the very beginning, I was very lost and also confused as to how the topic was relevant. But a little bit of further examination showed me that it was really important to realize that a lot of the basically literature around this topic is from just the last 2 to 3 years. This is something that's become increasingly prevalent, and so you're going to really have a lot of sources that are fairly recent that you'll be using in your rounds in order to justify your claims, attack your opponent's claims, and also most importantly show the judge that this is something crucial and pressing and that they must affirm in the world. What you need to do above all else is that you need to be showing these judges that there is a clear and present danger from the encrypted communications that we see in the status quo. And how specifically are you going to do that? Well, at the end of the day, it's really going to come down to a weighing mechanism. So what specifically is that? Well, the first thing that we have to look at is on the affirmative side, the most important thing that we're looking at is prevention. And what exactly is that prevention? Well, the thing that you're trying to prevent is any sort of crime, terrorist incidents, any sort of trafficking, and anything bad or illegal at all. What you need to be doing is talking about how this prevention specifically is more important than the key thesis of any neg case that you're going to run into, and that is privacy. What the neg is going to be running is that above all else, encrypted communications is important because it allows people to keep all of their data and a lot of the things in their phone completely private to themselves. And that's something that you need to outweigh through a magnitude of impacts. What you need to be proving is that everything that you bring up on prevention is significantly more important than what we see on privacy. And how exactly are you going to be doing this? Well, you need to be using things like human value weighing mechanisms. You have to talk about the value of life and how things like making sure that people are not harmed in criminal instances are significantly more important than keeping people out of your phone. So the thing that it's really going to come down to is just making sure that you're persuasive to the judge on why they have to advocate for you, and that's really important. But just a little bit of background information, there's one way that you have to specifically frame the topic, and it's really important because you need to specifically talk about why it's such an issue right now and why encrypted communications are not already accessible. We have evidence in the brief that I wrote that basically talks about the fact that warrants, even if they're gotten by the law enforcement agencies like the FBI or a local police department, don't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to access either a communication platform or a phone. So basically, what you need to be talking about is that you have something called warranted in access. And so what is this? Basically, warrant in access means that we're not able to access things even if we have a warrant. And what this is also known as is warrant proof. This is something that you'll see in a lot of the cards that you're looking at because encryption as a whole generally is fairly warrant proof. Because right now in the present world, there's not enough good technology to get around these things because what happens with encryption is that there's a key that basically scrambles all the messages that are sent and they're completely indecipherable unless you're in either end of the conversation, meaning that this locks you out of a ton of key data. But how exactly are you also going to frame this topic? Well, the other thing that you need to talk about is the fact that there's huge apps like Telegram that have billions of users. So what you're going to be talking about is specifically Telegram, apps like WhatsApp, and you have to be talking about how large they are. There's 1 billion people on Telegram, and it also has the capability to have channels that have 200,000 people. So then what you're going to be seeing is that terrorist groups and other sorts of criminal, bad actors are able to spread their message on a wide scale. So you have to frame the debate in a way that's able to show the judge that this is a clear issue that's basically just a clear and present danger because of the fact that they're able to have such a wide scope in the debate. But then additionally, there's also evidence in the brief that I bring up talking about the fact that a couple of years ago, the FBI itself, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was not able to access over 7,000 phones specifically because of encryption barriers. And this is something that's really important because you need to be telling the judges that if some of our most important law enforcement agencies are not able to gain access to some of the devices that they use to solve crimes, that is a very serious problem. But how specifically are we going to look at this topic? Well, one of the key ways that we look at it first is through preventing terrorism. This is something that I found on the affirmative side while researching that I found to be ridiculously compelling. Basically, there's a lot of evidence that talks about the fact that these communications platforms are the apps of choice for terrorist groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and more. And so what you'll see is that a lot of these platforms are things that have replaced old means of communication and have made terrorist groups more effective, more damaging, and also more popular. This is something that you'll also need to talk about in your rounds about how we don't want the spread of terrorist messaging through these platforms. Because there's platforms where Al-Qaeda will send missile guides, or where Hamas can show people how to build a rocket. Other sorts of things that allow for encryption to basically exacerbate the crime issues that we see in the status quo through terrorism, teaching people how to do things that we don't want them to know how to be able to do. Additionally, there's also some other evidence that talks about the fact that something like 90% of all terrorists in the year 2017 were recruited at least partially through apps like Telegram and WhatsApp. Basically, you're going to talk about the fact that most terrorist recruitment right now is going on because of what technology allows it to do. Most importantly, though, we also have some other evidence in the brief talking about the fact that there's a lot of different instances where this communication technology has been used to create very tangible harms. One of the first that comes to mind is in France, how after a terrorist attack in Paris in the early 2010s, even though police were able to recover a phone, they were completely unable to access any of the data within it because the communications platforms were encrypted. But then additionally, there's also further examples because in that same specific article that we talk about, there's also basically a lot of evidence talking about the fact that the same people responsible for that attack also used encryption technology to plan attacks on US Air Force bases in Europe, and also to plan different types of church attacks, whether that includes bombs, shootings, and more. Basically, there was one specific individual that had 3 completely different and also uniquely harmful instances of hurting other people through the capabilities of encrypted technology. But then additionally, we even have more evidence talking about the fact that this app of choice is something that was used in other areas of Europe. In Berlin in 2016, there was a person who planned a terrorist attack to drive a semi-truck through a Christmas market crowd, and he organized all of that through an encrypted platform. This also happened in 2017 in Russia, where a metro subway station bombing led to over 15 people dying, and authorities were not able to get into any of the devices, they were not able to access any of the content, and 15 people died, yet they weren't able to get justice specifically because of encryption. And this is something that has been a serious problem because of the fact that we're seeing it get more prevalent, more crimes on a better scale that's basically proving to us in the affirmative world that this is something worth addressing. But also, there's a couple of other impacts that you have to talk about as well. Because there's also things like disinformation, but also, most importantly, we see that there's also interference. And these things go hand in hand because basically, disinformation can lead to interference. So this right here is point A, and then this leads to the interference of point B. And how exactly is that? Well, first off, we have some evidence in the brief talking about the fact that the reason that there's so much disinformation on these platforms is because of the fact that a lot of encrypted platforms like Telegram, WhatsApp, and more have absolutely no moderation, which basically allows them to breed echo chambers of disinformation where people are told mistruths, flat out lies, and more. There's a key example that we have on the affirmative side of this brief talking about the fact that there's actually some really serious real-world harms to all of the basically disinformation that we see. There was an incident a couple years ago where there was significantly lower Hispanic vaccination rates for COVID-19 because there were basically images and memes circulating in Hispanic group chats on WhatsApp saying that these vaccines were unhealthy, but then also in a lot of Chinese group chats that the military was being deployed in order to prevent Chinese Americans from voting. This is something that is extremely concerning because it means that we were impacting or interfering in the real world. So you talk about how the disinformation for Hispanics and the disinformation for Chinese Americans led to an interference of their life, where they weren't able to get the vaccination they needed, or most importantly, they weren't able to vote. Because basically what you do is it creates basically an impact towards democratic backsliding. Because if we have less people voting, it means that people are being cut off from one of their constitutional rights to exercise their authority through showing their opinion. And so what you have to talk about is that this is important because encrypted communication specifically not only allows it, but makes it worse. And this is incredibly important. There's also other examples talking about the fact that there's another key way that we're able to basically distort opinions, harm elections, manipulate opinions, manipulate thoughts, and also kill people. And at first you might think that that's quite a big stretch, but there's evidence in the briefs talking about the fact that back in 2018 there was dozens of lynchings in India, specifically because of disinformation that was spread on platforms about individuals who were committing all these acts, and then people's retribution, which was completely unguided through these fake rumors, led to them committing an act that led to individuals losing their lives. These encrypted platforms specifically are at fault because they allowed the communication of all of these mistruths to occur in the first place. But then you also have to look at another key thing, and you have to affirm historical precedent. And this one's really interesting because it's also something that most teams will probably not be prepared for because it's a really complex idea. So let me break it down a little bit. One of the first things that you have to see whenever you're looking at any sort of technology is that generally, speaking in the United States, when you look at technology, law enforcement authorities are basically able to request data from it in order to solve crimes. Whether this is text logs, things like phone data, and more. There's a lot of unencrypted data that all of these law enforcement agencies already get. And so there's actually a lot of previous laws that I'm going to talk about specifically that have led to authorities getting the information that they need in the past. One of the biggest precedents for authorities getting access to tech info in order to solve crimes is called the Omnibus Crime and Safe Streets Act of 1968. Specifically, Title III of that act is called the Wiretap Act because it specifically allowed authorities to wiretap individuals with a specific set of guidelines on how exactly to do that. And so what were those guidelines? Well, you have to make sure that there's a probable cause, you have to make sure that there's some sort of restricted scopes, that you're not just taking all of the data from someone's life. You have to make sure that you've exhausted all other means of collecting data in the first place, and also you have to ask judges for exceptions to any requirements of the Wiretap Act that authorities do not think they will be able to meet. Meaning that there's a specific framework in place for people to get information if they work for law enforcement about a crime they're working on through means that exist. This Wiretap Act has allowed criminals to get put away and authorities to collect information that was absolutely vital to any investigations that they were partaking in. But then additionally, there's also another key act that was really important, and it's back from the 1990s, called the Kalia Act. We have some evidence in the briefs that talks about the fact that actually in the 1990s there was a law passed that technology, specifically like communications technology, had to be designed with law enforcement in mind. Basically what this means is that a lot of things like computers and all sorts of different machines had to have mechanisms in order to get data that could then be given to the authorities in the event of a crime. So basically what we need to see is that there's precedence for authorities getting information from communications companies in the past under Title III of the Omnibus Act called the Wiretap Act, and also most importantly from Kalia, which specifically mandated that technology ought to be designed to assist crime solvency. So I'm going to write both of those down really quick because we have Title III Wiretap, and that's a really important one that you'll want to have evidence for, but then also the Kalia Act. So if you're able to make sure that you have evidence on those in your case, you can use that to frame the app world by talking about the fact that, Judge, this isn't something we haven't done before. And this is going to be really important because that's another key burden of the affirmative side, is trying to show the judge that you're not just trying to have some ridiculous overreach of power, but that you're rather trying to expand something slightly that you already have, but that isn't able to keep up with the times. Obviously, technology from back in the 1960s and the early 90s is nothing like it is today, and our lawmakers could not have expected that at all. So basically, we need to update our laws rather than just make something completely new from scratch, and that's where you come up with the precedents to affirm your case and further extend the points that you're going to be making. But then, most importantly, at the very end of the debate, you have to make sure that you're able to be clear and concise on what specifically lawful access is. So basically, it's giving an authority some sort of access to information they need. So what is this specifically? Well, Telegram could be required to have copies of their keys to give to the authorities to decrypt certain types of messages. Call logs ought to be sent to authorities from WhatsApp if they're able to, or if they need that data, and more. Most importantly, you need to make sure that on the app side, you are trying to show that you have impacts that are going to be better for the average person than average neg impacts. So what it really comes down to at the end of the debate is A, do we want to protect people, or B, do we want to protect their data? Thanks, and I'll let Mason continue from here.
All right, guys, thank you, Michael, so much. I'm back. I had some McDonald's, and I'm ready to talk neg. First thing I want to get into is a couple of key arguments that you're going to come up with that you're going to see on neg. I think the main thing to point out is the reason why I boiled this down to just 3, whereas I have 12 arguments in the brief and you're going to encounter countless others, is that they all link back to effectively the same couple warrants. First being weakening security. So you're going to see so many arguments that hinge upon the warrant that imposing a backdoor weakens data privacy and it weakens security. What a lot of cards will tell you is that once you implement a backdoor, it's there for everyone, not just good actors. Because what you have to do is fundamentally change the way encryption algorithms work. No longer can you have end-to-end encrypted systems where a user's message is completely protected throughout the entirety of its transfer to the recipient. Instead, you have to create an encryption key or decryption key that can completely descramble the encryption algorithm and recover the user's information. In order to be able to decrypt those messages and give them to law enforcement, a backdoor decryption key has to be created. And once that exists, it exists for everyone. If that encryption key finds its way into the wrong hands, all of your data is not protected, which leads to a couple of impacts. The first being that if hackers have your data, they can do all kinds of things. One, they can like hack into, they can get social security numbers if you text it to somebody. They can get all kinds of crazy data that ruins the economy. I think, this is where I'm gonna get to. I really wanted to run a PQC argument, a post-quantum cryptography argument, and I have a lot of cards in the brief about it. I'm still looking for really good linked cards because my link chain in there is not what I would love it to be, but it's a really cool argument because I'll explain it real quick. Here's the idea, is that post-quantum cryptography is a different form of encryption that hold on, I'm totally getting off track here. I'll cycle back to that in a second. Go look at the briefs for post-quantum cryptography. It's really interesting. But anyway, moving on to our second idea, which is going to be surveillance. Big Brother is watching you. That is what the neg is going to say. On the idea of surveillance, it kind of links back to the idea that once a backdoor exists, it exists for everyone. And it's the idea that giving the government, especially the current administration, the Trump administration, that it's shown itself to be very, very adamant on collecting private information and using that for malicious means. Once the government has the ability to, at will, or with a warrant, which there's evidence to say is effectively at will for the government, they can even do so secretly. But once the government has a way to get access to private individual communications, a lot of negative impacts will happen. The first being restriction of the press. If the government can access journalism information, can access private data off of press members' phones, then it can suppress information that it doesn't really like. We've seen this happen in all kinds of countries with the Pegasus software developed by Israel. It's been used to hack into journalists' phones, steal their data. And I have a really good card that says, well, I have two actually good cards that I like. Both of them are in the brief. The first one says that attacks on the free press, especially surveillance of the press, is strongly correlated with other kinds of free speech violations, including extrajudicial killing of journalists. Once you surveil them and find out that some journalists are writing something you're not going to like, a lot of governments go and, Trump, I didn't say that. But anyway, the second idea is going to be that, or the second card that I have, which is really good, says that a free press is strongly associated with a more democratic system. So you're going to link into democratic backsliding impacts with this argument by saying that giving the government the ability to surveil the press at will prevent the press from being the necessary check on the government that's required to stop our slip into authoritarianism. I think that's going to be a very relevant argument considering our current political status quo. So I would check that one out in the brief. But there's a lot of other links on surveillance. I have an attorney-client privilege link that also has a good impact on democracy. I have just a general abusive surveillance. Sorry, my computer shut down there for a second. A general abusive surveillance argument that's really good. So I think surveillance is going to be a key warrant that you're going to have to watch out for on AF, and certainly think about running on neg. I don't think I got fully into weakening security. I kind of went off on my PQC rant. But what else is there to talk about? I'll come back to this guy in a sec. Our third warrant, I think, from what I've been gathering, is a racial inequality framing. A lot of arguments can be very effectively made that such legislation requiring lawful access would disproportionately impact people of color and communities of color. There's a couple of reasons. First, it's because damn near every wiretap, which is the modern method of surveilling communications without lawful access, but not damn near, but like 50% of them, which is a crazy number, are made in narcotics investigations. Narcotics investigations, part of the war on drugs, which is another, has a whole host of terrible impacts, disproportionately impact African American and communities of color. There's some really good cards that, even though white people use drugs significantly more than African American people are disproportionately stopped more for drug searches and critically surveilled more. There's so many examples of surveillance of communities of color, and giving law enforcement another method to do it is only going to enable them to further systemically oppress communities of color, which I think is going to be a really, really impactful argument because there's not much AF can say to it because it's just true. If you run the sort of idea that law enforcement isn't some end-all be-all good that AF is claiming it is, then even if you win the impacts of AF strengthening law enforcement, you turn that because what are they going to do with that extra power? They're just going to discriminate more. There's a second warrant on here that specifically communities of color respond negatively to surveillance, and I have a card in the mainly targets POC argument that says communities of color and their relationship with law enforcement is heavily formed by surveillance techniques. And so when law enforcement has more tools to surveil African American communities, they become more distrustworthy. They have higher rates of, I think it says, heart disease and anxiety. So all you're doing is strengthening the negative relationship between law enforcement and communities of color, and you're enabling the authorities to crack down harder on the people they discriminate against. I think those three are going to be the big three for neg. So now let's move on to how we're going to beat AF. I think that's the second really big part I want to talk about in this analysis. Besides outweighing and turning, I think there's going to be one really, really good response to AF. And that's going to be, no you don't. There's no solvency on AF. Now this is in my arguments as, I think it says criminals will find alternatives. And the idea here is just, this is not going to work. All you're doing is enforcing it on a US-based standard, which means that if you want to break the law and you were using an encrypted service in the US, you just go use an encrypted service from like Europe or whatever, and you're good. So AF does not get solvency. There's a lot of good cards on it, saying that this will only impact people who aren't criminals, because those are the ones who aren't really going to care a ton about switching to other services. So all you get is discrimination against people of color. You get no actual crime prevention. The second main response to AF that I think covers pretty much whatever they're going to say is that you don't, sorry, let me show the rest of my screen, is that you don't need lawful access in order to access criminal communications. And that's going to be the second response, is that there are alternatives for law enforcement. This idea is that, just, you know what I said. There are alternatives for law enforcement. They have so many other ways to access your communications. They can hack into your iPhone. They can send it to a third party to hack into your iPhone. They do it with like hundreds of thousands of iPhones per year or something crazy. I have a card on it. They don't need lawful access. In fact, when the FBI complains about how many phones it's not going to get into, it can't get into because there's no lawful access requirement, I have a really good card saying they're lying about those numbers. They're lying about them. They just don't have good enough programmers to be actually able to hack into the phones legitly, which they can totally do regardless. So instead of fundamentally reshaping the way encryption algorithms work, weakening all of our data, allowing government surveillance, just hire better nerds at police stations to be better able to hack into your phones, which is a really great card to point out that literally all of AF's impact statistics aren't real, because they all come from FBI statistics that are lying because of, I think they of programming errors, because they couldn't hack into the phones in completely normal ways that they're mostly capable of. And if they're not going to rely on their own staff to do it, what they can do is ship it over to other companies. There's like a couple third-party companies, I forget their names, but they can hack into most phones, like even very modern phones, which is actually really scary. Regardless. Also, there's the idea that genuinely most companies already comply with lawful access requests. Like if the government, if law enforcement, like a police station goes to Apple and asks them to hand over a user's data, if it's not encrypted, about 80 or 90% of the time, they'll do it. So we don't really need to force them into doing it. I mean, that's only a problem when there's when it comes to super encrypted data, but like I said, you can already hack into it. So if you can get the data without having a requirement, and you can decrypt it without having this piece of legislation, what do we need it for? I think that's a really good question to ask AF. Why can't our modern tools do it? Give me a number of, how many phones we realistically couldn't get into because we didn't have a lawful access requirement. Don't give me an FBI statistic. All of those numbers are from the FBI. And there's a really, really good card saying they're just all made up. Check the brief for that card. That's pretty much all I have on neg. Like I said earlier, it's a very straightforward topic. Read my briefs for more information on neg, which pretty much just gives you all the cards that I mentioned in this analysis. As long as you have these three warrants down and can respond to AF using those two arguments, you should win most debates. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching our first ever topic analysis. As always, please go to our website, download our brief for free this month, follow our Instagram for more updates, follow us on LinkedIn, on YouTube. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next month.